The blood soaked through the hospital sheets before my husband even looked up from his phone, and when the nurse asked him to hold my hand as I miscarried our second child, he told her he had a board meeting with his executive in 20 minutes and could not be late. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I sat with it for 2 years, and it nearly broke me in half. If you believe that people who abandon us in our darkest hour do not get to walk back into our lives whenever they please, if you believe in kindness that still has a spine, in forgiveness that is earned and not demanded, in hope that survives even the coldest winters of the heart, then before you read another word, please take a moment to like this story. Leave a comment about a time you had to choose yourself over someone who chose everyone but you, share it with someone who needs to hear that second chances are possible but never owed, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story like this one. Our community grows stronger every time we sit with each other's pain and come out the other side still believing in something good, and I am grateful you are here for this one. My name is Eleanor Hargrove, though everyone who loves me calls me Ellie, and on the Tuesday morning that changed the entire shape of my life, I was 34 years old, 11 weeks pregnant, and lying on a cold examination table in a paper gown that did nothing to stop me from shaking. I had felt the cramping start the night before, faint and low, the kind of ache I told myself was nothing, the kind of ache every pregnant woman convinces herself is normal because the alternative is too terrifying to consider. My husband, Richard Calloway, had been asleep beside me when it started, his back turned the way it had been turned for months, and I had lain there in the dark with my hand pressed against my stomach, praying to whatever was listening that our baby was still safe. By morning the pain had sharpened into something unmistakable, and by the time Richard drove me to the hospital, gripping the wheel with his jaw tight and his eyes flicking to the clock on the dashboard more than they flicked to me, I already knew in the quiet animal part of myself that we were losing this child. Richard and I had been married for 9 years by then. We met in our late 20s at a charity gala in Boston, back when he was a rising analyst at a mid-sized investment firm and I was a high school English teacher who had been dragged along by a friend who needed a +1. He wore a tuxedo that fit him a size too well and told me, within the first 10 minutes of conversation, that he thought most modern poetry was pretentious garbage, which should have been my first warning sign but instead made me laugh so hard that champagne nearly came out of my nose. He was funny then, and sharp, and he looked at me like I was the only interesting person in a room full of investment bankers, which, to be fair, I probably was. We married 2 years later in a small ceremony at my parents' orchard in Vermont, under apple trees that were just beginning to blossom, and I remember thinking, as I watched him wipe tears from his eyes during his own vows, that I had found a man who would choose me every single day for the rest of our lives. For a long time, he did. Richard worked hard, and he worked long hours, but in those early years he still came home smelling like the city and would pull me into the kitchen to dance to whatever was playing on the radio while dinner burned on the stove. He remembered which of my ribs still ached from a childhood fall out of a tree, which of my sisters I was closest to, which small cruelties from my father had left the deepest marks, and he handled all of that knowledge like it was something precious rather than something to be used against me. We tried for a baby for almost 3 years before I finally got pregnant with our son, Theodore, who arrived 7 weeks early and spent his first 17 days in the neonatal intensive care unit while I sat beside his incubator memorizing the sound of the machines that were keeping him alive. Richard was there for that. I want to be fair to the man he used to be, because that man sat in a plastic chair beside me for 17 nights and held my hand so tightly I sometimes lost feeling in my fingers, and when Theodore finally came home, healthy and strong and impossibly small, Richard cried into the baby's blanket in a way I had never seen him cry before or since. Theodore is 7 now, a sturdy, curious boy who loves dinosaurs and asks questions that have no good answers, like why the sky doesn't fall down or why grown-ups say they're fine when their eyes are red. He is the best thing I have ever made, and he is the reason I am still standing today, even after everything that came next. The trouble started, as trouble so often does, without any single dramatic moment I could point to and say, there, that was the beginning of the end. It crept in slowly, the way water gets into a foundation, invisible until the cracks start to show. Richard had been promoted 3 years earlier to a senior director position at his firm, and with the promotion came longer hours, more travel, and a new hire named Vanessa Sterling, who joined the company as an executive vice president and who Richard began mentioning at dinner with a frequency that, in hindsight, should have alarmed me far sooner than it did. Vanessa was brilliant, according to Richard. Vanessa had turned around a failing division in 8 months. Vanessa didn't waste time with small talk in meetings the way other executives did. I heard her name so often that I started to feel, absurdly, like I already knew her, like she was a colleague of mine rather than a stranger who had never once been introduced to me despite working alongside my husband for years. I am not a jealous woman by nature. I trusted Richard the way you trust the ground beneath your feet, without thinking about it, without needing to test it. So when the late nights became later, and the weekend calls became weekend trips, and the phone that used to sit face up on the kitchen counter began disappearing into his jacket pocket the moment he walked through the door, I told myself I was imagining things, that motherhood and part-time teaching and the general exhaustion of running a household had made me paranoid. I told myself this even as a colder, wiser part of me began quietly gathering evidence I did not yet want to examine. I got pregnant again when Theodore was 6, a surprise that felt at first like a second chance at the family life I had been slowly watching erode without fully admitting it to myself. I remember standing in our bathroom with the test in my hand, tears streaming down my face, thinking that this baby might be the thing that brought Richard back to me, back to us, the way Theodore's difficult birth had once bonded us so fiercely. I was wrong about many things that year, but I was never more wrong than I was about that. Richard's reaction to the pregnancy was polite. That is the word I keep returning to when I try to describe it, because it captures the wrongness of it better than any other word could. He hugged me, he said the right things, he told Theodore he was going to be a big brother, and then he went back to his phone, back to his calls, back to a version of distraction that had become so normal to me that I had stopped registering it as strange. I told myself that men process things differently, that he needed time, that once the baby was more real to him, once he could feel it kick or hear its heartbeat, he would come back to himself, back to us. I have spent a great deal of time since then thinking about how much of my life I spent waiting for a man to come back to himself, and how little I asked whether he had ever truly been there to begin with. The morning I began bleeding, 11 weeks along, was a Tuesday in early March, the kind of gray New England morning where the sky and the snow are nearly the same color and the whole world feels muted, holding its breath before spring. Richard drove me to the hospital with his hands tight on the wheel, and in the emergency room, as a nurse ran diagnostics and doctors spoke to me in the gentle, careful voices reserved for delivering bad news, my husband's phone buzzed against his thigh no fewer than 11 times in 40 minutes. I remember counting because counting gave me something to do with my mind that wasn't screaming. On the 12th buzz, he excused himself to take the call in the hallway, and through the thin curtain separating my bed from the corridor, I heard him say Vanessa's name in a tone I had once reserved only for me, low and warm and a little bit apologetic, the tone of a man who does not want to disappoint someone he cares about. He came back into the room 11 minutes later, just as the doctor confirmed what my body had already told me hours before, that our daughter, whom I had already begun to think of as a girl though there was no way yet to know for certain, was gone. I remember the exact words the doctor used: spontaneous pregnancy loss, incomplete miscarriage, and I remember reaching for Richard's hand and finding it already occupied with his phone, his thumb moving across the screen even as the doctor spoke, even as I began to cry in a way I had not cried since my grandmother's funeral 15 years earlier. When I asked him, my voice raw and broken, if he could please just put the phone away and hold my hand, he told me, without meeting my eyes, that Vanessa needed him on a call about the Prescott merger and that he would be back in 20 minutes. He was gone for 2 hours. I do not think I can adequately describe to you the particular kind of loneliness of grieving a child alone in a hospital bed while your husband sits in the parking lot outside, discussing quarterly projections with the woman whose name he says with more tenderness than he has said mine in over a year. A nurse named Patricia, whose kindness I will remember for the rest of my life, sat with me during those 2 hours, held my hand, and told me stories about her own 3 children to keep my mind from the silence of the room. When Richard finally returned, he apologized in the flat, efficient way he apologized for everything by then, a currency he spent freely because it cost him nothing, and he drove me home in near silence, his jaw tight, his mind clearly still on Vanessa Sterling and the Prescott merger and whatever version of his life existed outside the walls of our marriage. I did not confront him that day. I want to be honest with you, because I think the honesty matters more than making myself sound braver than I was. I was too broken that day, too hollowed out, to do anything but lie on our bed and let Theodore climb up beside me and ask, with the devastating directness of a 6-year-old, whether the baby sister he had been promised was coming back. I told him no, sweetheart, she's not coming back, and he cried the uncomplicated tears of a child who has not yet learned to hide his grief, and I held him and cried with him, and somewhere in the house I could hear Richard's voice, low and steady, on another phone call. The weeks that followed were an exercise in a particular kind of quiet devastation. I healed physically, the way bodies do, with a resilience that felt almost cruel given how little my heart had healed alongside it. Richard's behavior did not change, except to grow more pronounced. The late nights became routine. The trips to New York for what he called client meetings became twice monthly, then weekly. And Vanessa Sterling's name became a fixture in our home, spoken so casually, so constantly, that I began to feel like a ghost haunting the edges of my own marriage. It was my younger sister, Charlotte, who finally forced me to see what I had been too afraid to see clearly. Charlotte had always been the braver of the two of us, the one who said the things I only thought, and when she visited that April, 2 months after the miscarriage, she sat me down at my own kitchen table and asked me, with a gentleness that made it worse rather than better, whether I had considered the possibility that Richard was having an affair. I remember laughing, a brittle, unconvincing sound, and telling her that Richard would never, that we had been through too much together, that he loved his family more than anything. Charlotte did not argue with me. She simply reached into her bag and placed her phone on the table, open to a photograph she had found on a mutual friend's social media, taken at a company gala the previous month. In the photograph, Richard stood with his arm around Vanessa Sterling's waist, both of them laughing at something outside the frame, and the way he was looking at her, the openness of it, the unguarded warmth, was a way I had not seen him look at me in over 2 years. I do not remember much of the rest of that conversation. I remember Charlotte's arms around me on the kitchen floor, because at some point my legs had simply stopped holding me up. I remember Theodore's confused face peeking around the doorframe, and Charlotte quickly ushering him back to his room with a promise of ice cream. I remember, most of all, the particular sensation of a truth settling into my bones, a truth I had known for months without allowing myself to know it, the truth that my husband had already left our marriage in every way that mattered and simply hadn't bothered to tell me. When Richard came home that evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table with the photograph pulled up on my own phone, and I asked him, in a voice that surprised me with its calm, who Vanessa Sterling was to him. I watched something flicker across his face, not shame exactly, but the particular irritation of a man who has been caught doing something he did not intend to stop doing regardless of the consequences. He did not deny it. I will give him that small, bitter credit. He sat down across from me and told me, with the same efficient flatness he used for everything by then, that he had fallen in love with Vanessa over the past year, that things between us had been dead for longer than that, and that he was sorry for the timing of it all but that he could not keep living a lie. I asked him about the day of the miscarriage. I asked him how he could have taken her call, how he could have left me alone in that hospital bed while our daughter was being lost, and he told me, without a trace of the shame I was searching his face for, that the merger had been critical, that Vanessa had needed him, that he had assumed I would understand given how important his career was to our family's future. I remember staring at him, this man I had married under apple blossoms, this man who had once held my hand through 17 nights in a neonatal intensive care unit, and feeling like I was looking at a stranger wearing my husband's face. The divorce that followed was, in its own way, almost anticlimactic, the paperwork and lawyers and division of assets feeling like a formality after the real ending had already happened in that hospital room months before. Richard moved out within 3 weeks, into an apartment near his office that I would later learn Vanessa had helped him find. He fought for very little in the settlement, which I understood, even then, to be less about generosity and more about wanting to move forward unencumbered, wanting to shed the weight of his old life as quickly and cleanly as possible. He asked for reasonable custody of Theodore, which I granted because whatever else was true, Richard had always loved his son, and I would not be the kind of mother who used a child as a weapon, no matter how much I might have wanted to in my darkest moments. The 2 years that followed were the hardest of my life, harder even than the miscarriage itself, because grief for a lost pregnancy is at least a grief the world recognizes and makes space for, while the grief of watching your marriage, your family, your entire imagined future dissolve is a grief you are expected to simply manage quietly while continuing to show up for carpool and parent-teacher conferences and every ordinary demand of a life that does not pause for heartbreak. I went back to teaching full-time that fall, partly for the income and partly because I needed somewhere to put my mind that wasn't the wreckage of my marriage. I leaned hard on Charlotte, and on my parents, and on a small circle of friends who showed up for me in ways I will be grateful for until the day I die, bringing casseroles I didn't ask for and sitting with me through nights when the silence of the house felt unbearable. I will not pretend the road was straight or easy. There were nights I sat in Theodore's doorway after he had fallen asleep, watching him breathe, and cried until I had no tears left. There were mornings I could not get out of bed until the absolute last possible moment before I had to get him to school, mornings when the weight of what my life had become felt like something physical pressing against my chest. There was a particularly dark stretch, about 8 months after the divorce was finalized, when I stopped eating properly, when the weight fell off me in a way that worried my mother enough that she started driving the 2 hours from Vermont every weekend just to make sure I was taking care of myself. I am telling you this not for sympathy but because I think it matters that you understand I did not simply survive what happened to me through some effortless reserve of strength. I survived it the way most people survive devastating things, by falling apart in private and gluing myself back together in public, one difficult day at a time, until eventually the difficult days began to outnumber the unbearable ones. Somewhere in that first year, I began to notice small shifts in myself that I would later recognize as the beginning of healing, though it did not feel like healing at the time. I started running in the mornings before Theodore woke up, not because I cared about fitness but because the physical exhaustion helped quiet my mind enough to function through the day. I started writing again, something I had loved in college and had abandoned somewhere in the busy years of marriage and motherhood, filling notebooks with words that made no sense to anyone but me, words that were less about crafting anything beautiful and more about simply getting the poison out of my system one sentence at a time. I reconnected with old friends I had drifted from during my marriage, women who welcomed me back without judgment, who understood instinctively that grief sometimes makes us disappear from our own lives for a while. And slowly, almost without my noticing it happening, I began to become someone new, or perhaps someone old, a version of myself that had existed before Richard, before the years of shrinking myself to fit around his ambitions and his moods and his eventual absence. I took on the role of department head at my school, a position I had once turned down years earlier because Richard's career had always taken precedence over mine. I started volunteering at a local women's shelter on weekends, drawn there by an instinct I couldn't fully explain, though looking back I think some part of me recognized that the women there, women who had survived far worse than I had, were teaching me something about resilience that I needed to learn. I began dating again, tentatively, almost a year and a half after the divorce, though nothing serious came of it, mostly coffee dates with kind, unremarkable men who reminded me that I was still capable of being seen, of being chosen, even if none of them were quite right for the life I was rebuilding. Theodore, through all of this, remained the steady center of my world, and watching him adjust to his new reality, splitting his time between 2 households, taught me more about grace and resilience than any adult in my life ever had. He struggled at first, as any child would, asking painful questions I did his best to answer honestly without ever speaking badly of his father in front of him, a discipline that cost me more than I can express but that I believed, and still believe, was the right choice for him. Over time, he settled into a rhythm, thriving at school, making friends, developing an increasingly encyclopedic knowledge of dinosaurs that he would recite to me at length over dinner, and watching him laugh, watching him be simply a happy little boy despite everything that had happened around him, became one of the great sustaining joys of my life during those 2 years. Richard, for his part, largely disappeared into his new life. He and Vanessa married quietly about 14 months after our divorce was finalized, a fact I learned not from him but from a mutual acquaintance who mentioned it in passing, assuming I already knew. I remember the strange numbness of hearing that news, the way I searched myself for the devastation I expected to feel and found, instead, something closer to distant curiosity, as though I were reading about the lives of people I had once known a long time ago. Richard remained a reasonably consistent presence for Theodore, showing up for his scheduled weekends, attending school events when his calendar allowed, though even in this there was often a quality of distraction, of a man performing fatherhood rather than fully inhabiting it, that I tried not to resent too deeply, for Theodore's sake if not my own. It was in the second year, around the 18-month mark after our divorce, that I began hearing whispers, through the small, interconnected world of Richard's old colleagues and my own social circles, that things were not entirely well within his new marriage. I did not seek this information out, and I want to be honest that some part of me, a part one am not proud of but will not pretend did not exist, felt a small, sharp satisfaction whenever a new piece of gossip reached me. I heard that Vanessa had been passed over for a chief executive position she had been counting on, a loss that reportedly sent her into a spiral of controlling behavior at home. I heard that the two of them fought frequently and loudly enough that neighbors in their building had complained. I heard, from a friend who still worked at Richard's firm, that he had grown quiet and withdrawn at the office, a shadow of the confident, ambitious man who had once seemed to have every advantage in the world. I tried, as much as I could, not to dwell on these fragments of information. I had my own life to rebuild, and I was determined not to let Richard's unraveling, however satisfying it might have felt in some small, human corner of my heart, become the emotional center of my healing. I focused instead on Theodore, on my work, on the slow, steady reconstruction of a self I could recognize and respect. By the time the second winter after our divorce arrived, I had built something I was genuinely proud of, a life that was quieter and smaller than the one I had once imagined for myself, but that was mine in a way my marriage had stopped being mine long before I admitted it to myself. It was on a Saturday in late January, nearly 2 years to the week since the devastating morning in the hospital, that Richard reappeared in my life in a way none of us could have anticipated. I remember the day with unusual clarity, the way you remember days that end up marking a before and an after. It had snowed heavily the previous night, the kind of thick, silent snowfall that transforms an ordinary New England town into something out of a painting, and Theodore and I had spent the morning building a lopsided snowman in the front yard, his mittened hands clumsily patting snow into place while he narrated an elaborate backstory for the snowman that involved, somehow, a secret dinosaur origin. I remember laughing at his logic, feeling the particular warmth of an ordinary happy morning with my son, when I heard a car pull into the driveway that I did not immediately recognize. Richard stepped out of a modest sedan, not the sleek luxury vehicle he had always driven throughout our marriage and after, and even from a distance I could see that something about him had fundamentally changed. He had lost weight, not in the healthy way of someone who had taken up running, but in the gaunt, hollowed way of someone who had stopped eating properly, the way I myself had looked during the darkest months of my own grief. His coat looked a size too large on his frame, and as he walked toward us through the snow, I noticed that his hands were shaking, though I could not tell if it was from the cold or something else entirely. Theodore, unaware of any complexity, ran toward his father with the uncomplicated joy of a child, and Richard knelt down in the snow to hug him, holding on a beat longer than usual, his eyes closed, and I saw, even from where I stood, that his shoulders were trembling. When he finally released Theodore and stood, I asked our son to go finish the snowman's arms, giving Richard and me a moment of privacy, and Theodore, sensing without understanding that something serious was happening between his parents, obediently returned to his project a short distance away. Richard stood before me in the snow, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, he looked directly into my eyes rather than past me or through me or at some invisible point over my shoulder. He told me that Vanessa had left him 3 months earlier, that the marriage had collapsed under the weight of ambitions that had never actually included room for a genuine partnership, that she had, in fact, been quietly seeing someone else at her new firm for the better part of a year before she finally ended things with him. He told me he had lost his position at the company not long after, a casualty of internal politics that Vanessa's departure had left him vulnerable to, and that he had spent the last several months in what he described, with a rawness I had not heard from him in years, as the loneliest period of his entire life. I stood there in the cold, snow soaking slowly into my boots, and listened to my former husband unravel 2 years of carefully constructed emotional distance in the space of a few devastating minutes. He told me that he thought about the day in the hospital constantly, that he had replayed it 1,000 times in his mind, that he understood now, in a way he had been too selfish and too distracted to understand then, exactly what he had done to me, what he had taken from me, what kind of man he had allowed himself to become. He told me that losing Vanessa, losing his career, losing the life he thought he wanted, had stripped away everything that had been distracting him from the truth, which was that he had thrown away the best thing that had ever happened to him for the promise of something that turned out to be hollow at its core. And then, in the middle of my snow-covered front yard, with our son 20 feet away patting snow onto a lopsided snowman, Richard Calloway got down on his knees in the wet snow and asked me, with tears freezing on his cheeks, if there was any way, any possibility at all, that I could ever find it in myself to forgive him, to let him try again, to give their family a second chance at the life he now understood he had thrown away with both hands. I want to tell you honestly what I felt in that moment, because I think the honesty of it matters more than any tidy resolution I could offer you instead. I did not feel triumph, though I had, if I am truthful, imagined a moment like this during the darkest nights of the past 2 years, imagined Richard finally understanding what he had done, finally suffering some fraction of what he had put me through. What I felt instead, standing over him in the snow, was something quieter and more complicated, a strange mixture of grief for the young couple we had once been under those apple blossoms, and a clear-eyed recognition of exactly how far I had traveled from the woman who once would have knelt down beside him without a second thought. I did not answer him immediately. I asked him to stand up, because some part of me could not bear to see him kneeling there, not out of tenderness exactly, but out of a kind of exhausted dignity I wanted to preserve for both of us. I told him that I needed time, that 2 years of rebuilding myself from the ground up could not simply be undone by a single apology, however sincere it seemed, however much genuine suffering had produced it. I told him that I was no longer the woman who would reorganize her entire sense of self around his need for redemption, that whatever happened next, it would happen on my terms, at my pace, with my healing as the priority rather than his comfort. Richard nodded, and something in his face, some flicker of the man he might have once been before ambition and vanity had hollowed him out, seemed to understand and even respect what I was telling him. He asked only if he could continue being present for Theodore in the ways he had been, and I told him yes, that our son deserved a father who showed up, regardless of whatever happened between the two of us, and that this, at least, was something he still had the chance to get right. In the weeks that followed, I did a great deal of thinking, and talking, with Charlotte, with my mother, with a therapist I had begun seeing regularly in the past year to help process everything that had happened to me. I want to be clear that I did not rush toward forgiveness, and I do not think forgiveness, when it is real, is ever something that can be rushed. What I came to understand, slowly, through many long conversations and many longer nights of reflection, was that forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing, and that I could work toward one without necessarily committing to the other. I realized that I could forgive Richard, in the sense of releasing the poison of resentment that had been quietly eating away at me for 2 years, without deciding that our marriage deserved to be resurrected simply because he had finally arrived at an understanding of his own failures. I allowed Richard back into our lives slowly, cautiously, watching not his words, which had always come easily to him, but his actions over time, the true measure of any person's sincerity. He began showing up not just for his scheduled custody weekends but for smaller, less obligatory moments, Theodore's school science fair, a rainy Tuesday soccer practice, a dentist appointment he did not need to attend but asked to be included in anyway. He started therapy of his own, something I learned about not because he announced it dramatically but because Theodore mentioned, in the offhand way children mention things, that Daddy talks to a nice lady on Wednesdays about his feelings. He never asked me to take him back during those months, seeming to understand, finally, that the request itself needed to be earned through patience rather than demanded through desperation. It took the better part of a year, that second spring turning into another summer and then another autumn, before I allowed myself to consider the possibility of something more than careful, distant civility between us. What changed my mind, in the end, was not any single grand gesture but an accumulation of small, consistent moments that slowly rebuilt a foundation of trust one had once assumed was permanently destroyed. I watched Richard become, gradually and without fanfare, the kind of father who remembered which stuffed dinosaur Theodore needed to fall asleep and which one he had grown embarrassed to admit he still needed. I watched him take a lower-paying but far less consuming job at a smaller firm, a choice that would have been unthinkable to the man he once was, a man who had measured his own worth entirely by his professional ascent. I watched him, on the anniversary of our daughter's loss, show up unannounced at the small memorial garden I had planted in our backyard, kneeling not to ask anything of me this time but simply to sit in silence beside the young dogwood tree we had planted together in her memory, tears running freely down his face without any audience to perform for. It was that quiet, unwitnessed moment of grief, more than any grand apology in the snow, that finally convinced me the man kneeling in my backyard was someone different from the man who had once left me alone in a hospital bed to take a phone call. Grief, I have come to believe, is one of the few things in this world that cannot be faked convincingly over time, because it demands nothing from an audience and offers nothing but its own raw truth. We did not rush back together, even then. I want to be honest about the shape of what came next, because I think stories like this one too often skip toward a tidy, romantic reconciliation that does not reflect the slower, harder, more realistic work of actually rebuilding trust between two people. Richard and I began, tentatively, to spend time together outside of Theodore's presence, simple things at first, a coffee here, a walk through the orchard where we had once married, conversations that started stilted and careful and slowly, over months, began to recover some of the ease we had once shared. I watched him with a wariness that never fully disappeared, and I told him honestly, more than once, that I could not promise him a future, that I was allowing myself only to be curious about what might be possible, nothing more. It was almost exactly 2.5 years after that devastating morning in the hospital that Richard asked me, on a quiet Sunday afternoon while Theodore was at a friend's birthday party, whether I would consider trying again, not simply as a couple reconciling but as a family building something new and more honest than what we had before. I remember sitting across from him at our kitchen table, the same table where I had once shown him the photograph that shattered everything, and feeling, for the first time in longer than I could remember, that the decision in front of me was one I could make from a place of genuine choice rather than desperate need. I was no longer the woman who required him to complete some sense of herself. I had built that sense of self on my own, brick by difficult brick, over 2 years of solitary, unglamorous work, and whatever I decided next would be decided from strength rather than fear. I told him yes, cautiously, conditionally, with more boundaries and more honest conversation than we had ever managed to have during the entirety of our first marriage. We did not remarry quickly. We spent nearly a year in a kind of careful, deliberate courtship, attending couples counseling together even before we fully recommitted to each other, establishing, for the first time in our relationship, the kind of open communication we had never bothered to build when things were easy between us. Richard learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, to put his phone away, to show up fully rather than partially, to understand that love is demonstrated far more convincingly through consistent small actions than through grand romantic gestures performed under dramatic circumstances. We were married again, quietly, in the same orchard where we had first exchanged our vows, though this time under the golden light of an October afternoon rather than the pale pink blossoms of spring, a season that felt more honest to where we actually stood, past the flush of new beginnings and into something that had weathered real loss and come out the other side changed but intact. Theodore, 9 years old by then, stood beside us as we exchanged new vows, vows we had written ourselves rather than borrowed from any traditional script, vows that spoke honestly about failure and forgiveness and the hard, unglamorous work of choosing each other again every single day rather than assuming that choice, once made, would simply sustain itself without further effort. I will not tell you that everything since that day has been easy, because that would not be honest, and I have tried, throughout this story, to give you nothing but honesty, even when honesty was uncomfortable. There are still days when the old wound aches, when I catch myself watching Richard a little too carefully during a long work call, when the memory of that hospital bed rises up in me unbidden and I have to remind myself, consciously and deliberately, that the man beside me now has spent years proving himself different from the man who once left me there alone. Trust, once broken as badly as ours was broken, does not fully return to its original shape. What we have built instead is something new, scarred in places but sturdier for having been tested, a marriage that neither of us takes for granted the way we once did, because we both know now, with a clarity that only devastating loss can teach you, exactly how easily it can all be taken away. We welcomed a daughter 2 years after our second wedding, a healthy, fierce little girl we named Grace, in honor of everything it had taken for our family to arrive at the place where we could welcome her safely into the world. Richard was present for every single moment of that pregnancy and birth in a way he had never managed to be present before, holding my hand through every appointment, every worry, every small milestone, and when Grace finally arrived, red-faced and screaming and perfect, he wept over her in a way that mirrored, in some strange, redemptive echo, the way he had once wept over Theodore all those years earlier, before ambition and distraction had carried him so far away from the man capable of that kind of feeling. If there is a lesson in this story, and I believe there is, it is not simply that people can change, though I do believe that, having watched it happen slowly and painfully in front of me over the course of years rather than moments. The deeper lesson, the one I hope settles into your heart the way it settled into mine, is that forgiveness, when it is real, is never owed to anyone, and it should never be extended out of weakness, out of fear of being alone, out of the desperate hope that reconciliation will fill some hole inside yourself that only you have the power to fill. I did not forgive Richard because I needed him. I forgave him, eventually, because I had first done the harder work of learning to stand entirely on my own, and only from that place of genuine strength was I able to look at his transformation honestly and decide, freely, that it was real, and that it was worth the risk of trying again. Before I close this story, I want to ask you something, because I think the stories that matter most are the ones we carry forward into conversation with each other rather than simply consume and forget. I would love for you to leave a comment below about a moment in your own life when you had to choose between the safety of staying closed off and the harder, braver work of extending forgiveness on your own terms, in your own time, for your own healing rather than anyone else's comfort. I want to hear about the people in your life who taught you that second chances, when they are given, should be earned through patience and consistency rather than granted out of loneliness or fear. If this story touched your heart even a fraction as much as living it touched mine, I would be so grateful if you would take a moment to like this video, to leave a comment sharing your own experience with forgiveness or healing or rebuilding a life you thought had been permanently shattered, to share this story with someone in your life who might need to hear tonight that second chances are possible without ever being obligatory, and to subscribe to our channel so that you never miss another story about the long, difficult, ultimately hopeful journey back toward wholeness after devastating loss. Our community exists because of people like you, who show up not just to be entertained but to sit honestly with the hard and hopeful truths of what it means to survive heartbreak and, somehow, against every reasonable expectation, come out the other side still capable of love. Theodore is 12 now, tall enough to look me nearly in the eye, still obsessed with dinosaurs though his interests have expanded to include a bewildering array of video games I do not fully understand. Grace is 4, a whirlwind of curls and stubbornness who has her father wrapped so completely around her small finger that I sometimes tease him about it, watching him melt at her slightest request in a way he never once melted for me during the early years of our marriage, and watching this, rather than making me bitter, mostly just makes me grateful that he learned, however painfully, however late, what it truly means to show up for the people who depend on him. I planted a second dogwood tree in our backyard the spring after Grace was born, beside the first one we had planted for the daughter we lost, and some mornings, when the light comes through the kitchen window just right, I stand at the sink washing dishes and watch Richard walk out to that quiet corner of the yard, coffee in hand, and simply stand there for a few minutes in silence before starting his day. I do not know exactly what he thinks about during those quiet moments, and I have learned not to ask, understanding that some griefs are meant to be carried privately even within the closest of marriages. But I know that the man who stands there now, present and unhurried and unafraid of his own sorrow, bears very little resemblance to the man who once could not spare 20 uninterrupted minutes for me in a hospital room, and that transformation, hard-won and imperfect and real, is the truest kind of love story I know, truer by far than the easy romance of apple blossoms and young promises made before either of us understood what love would actually require of us. If you have made it this far with me, thank you for sitting with this story, for holding space for both its darkness and its light the way so many people once held space for me during the 2 hardest years of my life. Whatever you are walking through right now, whatever betrayal or grief or seemingly impossible healing lies ahead of you, I hope you carry with you the knowledge that you are allowed to take exactly as much time as you need, that forgiveness is a gift you give yourself as much as anyone else, and that second chances, when they come, should always be built on the solid ground of who you have become rather than the fragile hope of who someone else might finally decide to be. Please remember to like this video, share your own story in the comments below, pass this along to someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel, because our family here believes, deeply and unapologetically, that even the coldest winters eventually give way to spring.